Hello, you're listening to Over the Oxer podcast with Tracy Cole for all things to do with the mind for equestrians. I am delighted to welcome Ellie Halsey onto the podcast. Ellie is a performance coach. She's a BHSI, which for those of you outside of the UK is a British Horse Society instructor, which is a high level riding instructor. She's also a British Equestrian Level 4 coach. She has an MSc in professional practice in sports coaching. And she's been coaching for almost 30 years, so she knows a thing or two about coaching. She works as an equine lecturer at a further education college, and she also holds a coaching and mentoring certificate. And another hat that she sometimes wears, I'm not quite sure how she has time, is that she's an expedition leader for Camps International. And she's off to Kenya in July for 4 weeks, so we might ask her all about that as well. So big warm welcome, Ellie. How are you?
Oh, I'm really good, and I'm really excited to be chatting to you. So thank you very much for the introduction. It's very it makes you feel a bit awkward. Typically British, don't really like hearing about ourselves very much.
But most of that is not kind of blowing your own trumpet. It's just factual. You are just those things, you know. We're going to find out more and more about you and more about all the fantastic work that you've been doing. But first of all, I ask most people about a horsey journey, where it started. Were you a horsey kid, or have you come to it later in life?
Well, I mean, I don't really remember this, but apparently from the age of about 3, I really wanted to learn to ride. And we lived in central Bristol at the time. There's not a huge amount of horses, as you can imagine, in central Bristol. And also, we didn't have a car as a family either. So, accessing horses was probably a bit challenging. And then I think my mum says that she promised me that when we got a car that she'd take me for horse riding lessons, which happened, I think, when I was about 8 or 9. And then I sort of didn't look back really. But I mean, I would say I was your typical sort of riding school kid. I didn't have my own horse. I didn't have my own horse till I was 30. Had to wait a long time for one. Um, but I was at the stables every weekend and helping out, and was just
Mm.
sort of obsessed, as a teenager. And then I went to Hartbury College when I was 16 and did a equine course there, similar to what I do now in a teaching capacity. Um, and I think I always knew that I didn't want to work in a sort of typical, office environment. I love the outdoors, and I loved obviously horses, and I love people. So combining all of those, and I was very lucky to have access to some really great coaches as I was sort of growing up and learning to ride, and throughout my sort of working life, really. So that's sort of what I suppose has inspired me to kind of keep going on that journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think you always wanted to be a riding coach, or did you want to be a professional rider or something else?
I don't think no, not a professional rider. I think mainly because I was quite realistic in terms of what I could access. And whilst I was, able to ride lots of horses through working as an instructor and a coach, and a yard manager and so on, as I say, it took a long time for me to get my own horse. And so I was quite realistic in terms of my expectations along that. Um, but I think I always had the coaching pathway in my mind, because that was something that I suppose, yeah, being sort of inspired by other coaches was something that I sort of aimed to be able to do myself.
Mm.
I probably never expected that I would get as far as I have. I don't think I had in my mind that I'd get to BHSI or do a master's in sports coaching or anything like that. So that's been a kind of really nice um, icing on the cake, I suppose, really. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so at the moment then, how is your working life split between the coaching and working in the college?
So I in my college role, I do a bit of a combination. I would say it's mainly lecturing, classroom, but it's also with some practical and coaching as well. So we coach them in practical tasks on the yard as well as in riding. And then I do a little bit of freelance outside of college as well. And really, I think I sort of took a bit of a change of direction. I really enjoyed being in the sort of formal education environment because I hadn't done a university degree when I was younger. Um, and I really love learning and developing and that sort of striving to be, better
Mhm.
at whatever it is that you choose to do, really. So I've felt like I would like to be in a sort of education environment, and sort of develop that further, and potentially do further qualifications in the future, and potentially. I think I said to you when we were chatting earlier that I've sort of tentatively thought about a professional doctorate, but parking that idea just for now, but not putting it away.
No, and now you've said it publicly, so now
Yeah, oh God,
now you've
yeah.
got to go and do it.
Can't take it back now, yeah.
So, I've been doing a course in kind of like the psychology of coaching. I've been a trainee, if you like. I've learned about 1,000 new phrases that I didn't realize existed. But one of the phrases that hasn't cropped up yet, because the course is ongoing, is that specialism of yours, your research specialism, which is emotional labour. So I was fascinated to read a blog that you'd written for Riders' Minds all about it. What is it, and why is it important to equestrians?
So emotional labour, I would say it's common to not know much about it, although it has been around in research since sort of the early 80s. It's not that widely known about, and certainly I couldn't find any research about it from an equestrian coach perspective. Although sport coaching in general is acknowledging it, the importance of emotional labour, and we can think of emotional labour being really, in our daily lives, we're required to manage our emotions in a variety of contexts, and that might be, within your personal relationships, social interactions, maybe driving to work in your car. You might have to manage your emotions a bit sometimes in those situations, but the concept of emotional labour is sort of looking at, if you're undertaking emotion management in the work role, in a paid role for sort of organizational or professional expectations, then it becomes a type of labor, and it can be as effortful as other types of labor, such as cognitive or psychological or physical.
Yeah.
And so similarly, we have to be mindful that that can have an impact on us. And it can be tiring and draining, and it can be massively rewarding as well. But recognizing that we are undertaking emotional labor and taking steps to guard against any possible detrimental effects is something that's really important. And um, initially, when the concept was sort of developed, it was very much thought of as a concept that applied mainly to kind of public facing roles like service roles,
Yeah.
but it's now been sort of broadened to, recent research sort of tells us that if we are in a work environment that requires any interpersonal interactions, we are very likely to be undergoing emotional labour in those interactions.
Right, yeah. So, would it be right or wrong to say it's kind of like suppression of your emotions? You know, if you're really angry at work, but you know it's not the right place to be angry, so you kind of hide it in some way. Would that be right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it can be, and it's important to remember that they're not necessarily always negative emotions that we're managing. It could be even like,
Okay.
oh, you want to laugh and it's not appropriate.
Right, right.
Um, but absolutely. And so it can be um, sort of swallowing an instinctive reaction or emotion and kind of trying not to show it to maintain maybe a professionality, or because maybe your natural reaction could be hurtful to the other person, or yeah, you might be really irritated by somebody in your workplace, but you can't show that because it's not appropriate and it's unkind or whatever else it might be. Or, such and such a client is, here they are again with another question. But
Yeah.
so it can be anything. And so what you're describing, that sort of hiding maybe your natural instinctive reaction and kind of faking an outward reaction, is what we would call surface acting. And so surface acting is one of the terms. So Arlie Hochschild, who was the original researcher who sort of defined the concept of emotional labour, she identified two main coping strategies. So one of them is surface acting. And so we can think of that as being, faking an outward display of emotion. So whether that's like plastering a smile or, whatever it might be. And then the second coping strategy is deep acting. And that is, you can think of it a little bit like method acting. You know how those actors that sort of
Yeah.
become the character and they kind of try and really feel the feelings of the character. So deep acting is sort of effortfully changing your feelings to match the expectation. And so both of those, particularly surface acting, have been found to have a negative impact on you as a person. So surface acting, because you have this sort of discrepancy between your inner genuinely felt emotions and your outwardly portrayed emotions, the strain of that, the two sets of
Mm.
emotions being at odds with each other and you having to manage that, can create what we call emotional dissonance. And that's that sort of uncomfortable feeling where, it's a feeling of strain is probably the best way to describe
Yeah.
it. And that's a precursor to burnout. It can be a precursor to emotional exhaustion and burnout.
Oh God.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it can have quite a big impact. And then deep acting, there's a lot of mixed results in the research about whether that's detrimental or not. And ultimately, I think really there's a sort of neutrality to that. Like we don't really know. It could be detrimental,
Mhm.
but we know that it's not as detrimental as surface acting. So out of the two strategies, it's preferred one. But then it can still have an impact on you. So Hochschild looked at aircrew in her original research, and she encountered this sort of deep acting that the air crew were going through. So, having to be happy and
Yeah.
but actually really embodying that and feeling it. And the result of that was often that they were so kind of energized by this deep acting that even though they'd done a really long shift on a flight, they were going home and they couldn't sleep, they couldn't switch off, because
Gosh.
their sort of
Yeah.
their whole body and their sort of psychological state was kind of in high alert from having to be kind of happy and positive. And so that can obviously have an impact on your life outside of work as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing because we all do it at some time or another, don't we? Did you find in your research, or is there research to show that there's a bias towards women doing it more? I'm thinking that women might do it more to, or not exactly people please, but to kind of be on the same level as everybody else.
That's a really interesting question. So I when I looked for participants for my study, I had a really good response. I think it was over 40 people responding. I couldn't take that many. And some people naturally sort of dropped out a bit as they went along. They perhaps didn't have time to fill out the forms and so on. But the coaches I interviewed were all women. Um, Out of the over 40 that responded, there were two men,
Yeah.
one who responded so late, and I'd already sort of got most. I ended up interviewing 13 people, and my supervisor sort of said, look, 10 would have been enough, Ellie, you need to stop, we're not going to have time to write all this up. But I really enjoyed talking to them and it was so interesting. But yeah, so there was one who, and it was a bit late to the party, and then there was another one who had offered, but by that point I was a bit unsure about interviewing him anyway, because I felt like there wasn't enough balance actually, and so I didn't add him in. Um, Again, because I had enough participants
Yeah.
already,
Yeah.
but also I feel like if you want to be able to make a comparison, you need to be able to have enough of a cohort of male respondents to be able to make a judgment on how that would compare. But I think for future research, if anyone out there is interested in doing research on emotional labour, I would really be interested. Anecdotally, one of the coaches that I spoke to said a family member of hers was also a coach, and she talked to him about it, and he was like, "What are you talking about?"
Oh,
I
that
just
is
I just tell them
really
what to do. I don't know what you're
interesting.
talking about. Now that doesn't obviously speak for all men, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think I would be really interested to read more about in other professions if they've done a comparative study on men and women, because I think you're right. I think there's a lot to unpick there, really.
I think just because obviously I'm not saying anything against men, but women are more emotional creatures. Men tend to be. I'm adhering to stereotypes here, but tend to be a bit more logical. So they tend to present themselves. This is me. This is as I am. Take me or leave me. Whereas women tend to try and manipulate themselves, don't they, to the situation or the crowd that they're in, just to, yeah, just I think it's so that you don't stand out. You're not different from the crowd in any
Yeah.
way. Yeah. And so tell us about what was your research about? What was the main aim of it then?
But the main aims really was to sort of explore equestrian coaches' experiences and perceptions of emotional labour, because I wasn't even sure if anybody would know what I was talking about. Or because for me, part of the motivation for it was I have an interest in the interpersonal sort of um, relationships in coaching. And for me, I felt that over the time I've coached, I had found that sometimes a difficult aspect of coaching to manage personally. And so I had a genuine interest in wondering whether anybody else had experienced that.
Mm.
Um, I obviously had to come at it from a very neutral place. So I had no expectations as to whether it would be positive, negative. They might say the same sort of thing. I no, never had that problem.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so it was kind of exploring what their understanding or perception of it was, and whether they'd had any sort of relevant experiences, and if so, what that looked like really for them. And then whether that had an impact. So I didn't sort of think it was either negative or positive, but had it had an impact on them. Um, and and lastly, what did they sort of engage in any coping strategies that they had sort of come up with themselves, or that they knew about that sort of helped them manage any potential effects? So those are the kind of sort of key aims really of the research.
yeah, yeah. And so what did you find? I know this is going to go out for publication at some point, so I know you can't get into the real nitty-gritty, but overall, what were your more qualitative findings?
It was really interesting. And so ultimately, the answer is yes. Nearly all of the coaches I spoke to had experienced emotional labour in some form. They they often hadn't heard of the term or the concept of emotional labour, but they spoke about that sort of that emotional impact of coaching. Now, what I loved about it was that they often spoke in really passionate sort of terms about the highs that coaching can bring.
Mm,
So some of them spoke about that sort of that kind of flow state, that when you're in a really great sort of coaching
yeah.
relationship and you have a really great positive session. I think one described, oh, it was amazing. We were having this great session, and it was snowing, and all of a sudden we suddenly looked around and there was like 2 inches of snow we hadn't even noticed, because we were sort of in the zone.
Yeah, yeah,
And they used words like euphoria and I can't remember the others, but it was lovely. And one was sort of saying, oh, I was setting the arena up and I knew I've got to be in the arena for the next 6 hours, and I was tired, and I just sort of thought, oh, this is going to be a long day. And then I blinked and it was over, and I'd had the most amazing time, and it was things like that. And so I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that emotional engagement that you sort of employ with your riders and people that you work with, and in any workplace, that there's a lot of positives that come with that. However, uh, one of the big things that the coaches struggled with, I would say, was often finding or feeling as though they were a kind of untrained counsellor.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that they sort of felt a bit like they didn't have the equipment and the tools to deal with sometimes people kind of pouring their hearts out to them or needing a lot of support. Having said all of that, they felt it was really important that they still listened and allowed the rider to park that emotion a bit, because
Yeah.
they felt that if they didn't do that, there would be a barrier to the sort of rider and horse
Yeah.
working together coherently and having a productive session. And so, if anyone's listening, and some people, because some of the coaches said, "Oh, I realised I do that to my coach," and I think if you're a rider, you shouldn't feel you can't do that. I think what needs to happen, probably from our perspective as coaches, is that in coach education and development, perhaps we need to consider and acknowledge that's a really important part of coaching, and think a little bit about perhaps how can we equip our coaches with better tools that they can cope and manage these kind of um, moments where they perhaps feel a bit overwhelmed,
Yeah.
because one person is fine, but and if you know how to kind of manage that and park it yourself, and not feel like you're responsible for fixing somebody's problems, but you
Yeah.
can listen to them and let them offload. But because one person may then be eight people, and then by the time you've got to the end of the day, you shouldn't be carrying around eight people's worth of emotional sort of baggage, for want of a better word, because you can't, like, the best will in the world, you can't do that, you can't carry that round with
Mm.
you. So it's having, coping strategies really, and sort of being able to know how to manage that and be confident that it is part of coaching, that we all do, and it's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really interesting because I obviously teach and train people in mindset, and a lot of people who come onto my courses are riding coaches who say exactly what you've said. They say, not, they're not complaining about it. They're saying, but I am a counsellor, stroke social worker, so stroke psychologist, untrained, and sometimes their lessons involve just walking around with somebody. The person's just on the horse walking and talking, and they're just by the side listening, and that's the lesson over. And they come onto the trainings because they want to be able to help people a bit more with their mindset. So that's really interesting that you mention it, that it's very common. I've noticed it in people who come on the courses, but I didn't know how common it was amongst coaches in general. So the people that you interviewed, did they specify what kind of coping strategies they had if they were bombarded with 8 people a day and who needed counselling or some kind of therapy?
Yeah, so a lot of them sort of had some kind of peer or social support in place,
Yeah.
and so research supports that, that peer or social support is really, really key in making sure that you can mitigate any sort of spillover effects, so that you don't sort of have it impacting your home life, and you don't feel like you're burning out because you've got nothing left for your family or your
Yeah.
partner or whoever it might be at the end of the day. And a lot of them had a friend, sometimes a fellow coach. Didn't have to be anyone horsey. Quite often it wasn't anyone horsey at all. There was one coach who had a sort of with her and other people in her workplace, they had a kind of a reciprocal peer support agreement with sort of
Yeah.
managers, so that they could um, do the same for each other, really. And again, they didn't have to be a fellow horsey person; it could be a manager from a different area. Um, so that was really kind of common for their way of sort of offloading,
Yeah.
and a kind of almost like a couple of people talked about what sounds like an informal community of practice, like coaches who work in the same yard, riding school, what have you, sitting
Mm.
together and having lunch together and going, oh, this is what I had this morning, how about you,
Yeah.
and kind of
Yeah.
just sharing that. And actually that's a really great way of supporting each other, um, and allowing you to kind of get it, you know get it out a little bit,
Yeah,
really.
yeah, yeah.
The other thing that a couple of them did was a sort of um, a kind of reflection. So one said she kind of voice noted when she walked her dog, or sort of
Right. Yeah.
did a kind of verbal reflection on how what she'd found challenging particularly, and that was a good way of emotionally sort of resetting. Um, and that's not necessarily supported anywhere that I could find in the research, but what it's quite similar to is something called a challenge appraisal. And so that's you might be familiar with them. So it's a way of kind of reframing an experience into a positive challenge. So when we find experiences stressful, we tend to sort of our brain interprets it as a threat. And so a challenge appraisal can be a way of sort of reframing that experience into a positive challenge. So we can adopt a bit more of a growth mindset in relation to the experience. So if it was something where you recognized that you had to manage your emotions and you were engaging in emotional labor or surface acting maybe in that moment, you might then look at it and think, well, yes, I did that in the moment, but it was appropriate for this reason. And actually, if I hadn't done that, then the rider might have
Yeah.
lost confidence in me, or
Yeah.
because it can be anything. Like we think of the emotional labor as sort of hiding emotions, but when someone's about to fall off, or maybe and we are the calm person in that
Yeah.
moment, but inside we're panicking, but nobody can tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's things like that, and actually, if I hadn't managed my emotions really well in that moment, it could have all gone wrong, because the horse would have heard the panic in my voice, the rider definitely would have heard the panic in my voice,
Yeah.
and so you're just kind of giving yourself that space, I would say, to sort of work through that and really make sure that you are understanding, that you're recognizing what happened and giving yourself a sort of a time to reflect on it. And were there any other strategies I could have employed? Was there alternative action available to me at that time? Maybe there was. Maybe I could try that. And actually, next
Mm.
time, that I might think of that instead. Or perhaps it's experiences that trigger a strong emotional reaction in yourself. And so some of the things that the coaches did speak about, what they found particularly difficult, was um, situations where the horse perhaps wasn't being considered. Maybe the rider was a bit uh, not harmful necessarily, but just a bit unkind to the horse, or frustrated, or they were letting their emotions get the better of them, or whatever it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And that was something that they found challenging. And so again, if you kind of know the situations that you're much more likely to find it hard to manage your emotions, you can be better prepared for it and better equipped for it, and
Yeah.
figure out a coping mechanism in advance. Like, how can you calmly work through that situation, get your rider on board and realizing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And really, I think personally, this isn't something necessarily that I can prove in research or anything, but I think as coaches, we are essentially helping our riders to learn to become more emotionally intelligent themselves.
Yeah.
But and again, that's not necessarily something we know how to do. We kind of do it as we go, because we know horses and we understand them, and we know that those emotions can impact the horse negatively. So again, that's perhaps somewhere I would love to see, us going in as an industry in terms of coach education and development, um, helping coaches to support that in riders, because I think, there's all kinds of welfare aspects that we're talking about a lot at the moment, but being able to manage emotions is a really important one for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely for all their welfares. Did you find anyone in the questionnaires that you did? Did anybody say that they'd been through burnout or high levels of stress as a direct result of having to contain their emotions?
So I didn't do questionnaires. I actually did semi-structured interviews online.
Okay, yeah.
So we did a lot of discussion, and but what I would say, there was a couple of coaches that I spoke to that said at times I felt like giving up. I
Oh,
found it I
mm,
found it too hard to manage the sort of emotional exhaustion. Um, So I think there is a genuine risk of burnout. Definitely, they reported emotional sort of depletion of reserves. So feeling like you have nothing left over at the end of a day, feeling like you kind of got nothing left for whoever else is in your life afterwards. Disruption of sleep, which is again a proven sort of effective emotional labour. And yeah, and that sort of emotional exhaustion. So whilst they didn't necessarily specify burnout, I think it was, you could conclude that there was a risk to
Yeah.
several of them of potential burnout.
Yeah. So would you, I presume you want to go to things like the UKCC and the BHS and present this paper and the research findings and see if something can be done in the teaching and training of coaches. Have you been able to speak to anybody yet?
So no, not yet. And what I'm hoping, as you say, is once I've got the paper published, then definitely that's what I'd love to do, is just approach governing bodies and just see if they are able to consider incorporating it into some of the coach education programs. I think it would be something that would be beneficial. Yeah.
Yeah. And just because you mentioned your doctorate, that I know you said it's maybe not quite on the near horizon, but you have mentioned it, and it's something you'd like to do aspirationally. If you had, like, unlimited funds and unlimited times, and you can go and do your doctorate tomorrow, what would you do it in? What would be your main feature in your research?
That's a really good question. There's so many directions I think you could go with this topic. I think, like you mentioned earlier, comparative study between men and women would be really interesting to understand if there are differences in their experiences, and if so, what. The other thing I thought of was the coaches that I ended up speaking to for the research. They were fantastic, and I'm so grateful to them, by the way, which I should have said earlier on. I'm so grateful to them all for sharing their experiences, because they were so open, and without their sort of input, research just isn't possible. Um, However, I would say most of them were very experienced coaches, and so
Yeah,
they ranged from sort of a BHS stage 3 complete horsemanship right up to fellowship and UKCC level 4. And the minimum amount of years anyone had been coaching was, I think it was 5, and the maximum was something like over 50.
oh
Um,
gosh.
so most of them were very experienced,
Yeah,
and so I think newly qualified coaches, I'd be really interested to know whether there's a difference between them and experience, because these coaches I spoke to generally, like we mentioned earlier, had come up with some coping mechanisms themselves. And I wonder whether or not, with newly qualified coaches, whether they've been able to get to that point yet, or whether they sort of have experienced that kind of emotional labor and that
yeah,
exhaustion side of things yet, whether they found that hard to manage or not. It may not be something that's as relevant to them because of the shorter time they've been doing it. But equally, we want good coaches to keep coming through, and so making sure that we can perhaps catch them at that early level may mean that we can make sure that they stay in the business and stay
yeah,
supporting riders and horses for longer.
yeah,
um, yeah, and then the other thing I thought would be really interesting would be to sort of perhaps some of the recommended coping strategies, um, somehow measure how effective they are.
yeah,
So if we had a cohort of participants, perhaps that we could, set them doing challenge appraisals or reflective, um, voice notes or written pieces or whatever it is, and self assess and notice whether they find that any sort of benefit, um, would be a really interesting one as well.
yeah. And I suppose it depends on their type of the person, the equestrian that they're training or they're coaching, because it might be different if you're coaching somebody who's a teenager to coaching somebody
Yeah,
who's in their 40s with kids and work and all kinds of stresses. It may be very different for different coaches just because of the cohort that they get in.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I think with young people, you're really, teenagers can have very volatile emotions, can't they? And things
Mm,
they can have very sort of strong emotions, and sometimes it can be really hard for them to cope with them. And I think it's a really important it's a really important tool that horses can teach us to sort of put another being's needs first. And one of the things I'm always saying to the students is, people say that horses can't talk and we wish they could talk, but they're talking to us all the time. They're talking to us with their bodies and their body language, and we just need to learn how to listen better. Um, because most of the time they're telling us a lot of information, but we just don't hear it.
mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, if anyone's interested in the study, and as we said before, it's not published yet, but it will be. Where could they find any details at the moment?
So, well, hopefully, once it's published, I will be putting it all on the LinkedIn page.
Yeah, yeah.
um,
It's splashed
yeah,
all over the internet.
but otherwise, please visit the Riders Mind website. They're a fantastic charity, as you all probably know, and they have got a lot of support for riders. But they're also really developing, support for coaches. Hence, partly why they published this blog page that I did, and also completely forgotten her name, the lady that did the research about burnout. They published an article about that as well. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff, and they're going to be doing a lot to help support coaches as well. So yeah, visit their website, support riders'
Fabulous.
minds as well.
Fabulous. And how can people catch up with you? You're on LinkedIn? Are you anywhere else on socials?
Yes, I am on LinkedIn. I'm not that much for social media person. I am on Facebook and Instagram, but I don't really post anything on there, to be honest.
Okay, okay.
I'm
So
a bit old-fashioned, I know.
LinkedIn's the best place to link up with you.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
that's perfect. That's perfect. Thanks ever so much. That has been so fascinating to hear it from the coach's side of things, and also the fact that we all probably do it a little bit, and to think of it as a labor, as something effortful. I've never really thought too much about that, but you're entirely right. It is definitely a labor. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've loved talking about it. As you can tell, I don't shut up about it, but yeah,
No, I think you should. I think you should keep shouting about it because it's really important. Thanks ever so much.
thank you.